Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Savannah, Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the spring of 1851, a peculiar entry appeared in the medical journal of Dr. Thomas Wentworth, a physician well regarded in Savannah's medical community. The entry, discovered decades later during a renovation of the Georgia Historical Society building in 1964, detailed a case that Dr. Wentworth himself described as medically inexplicable and deeply disturbing to rational thought. The subject was a woman known only as Sarah, an enslaved person on the Fairchild Plantation, located approximately 12 miles outside of Savannah proper. What made her case remarkable wasn't her status or name, but rather what happened to her eyes, and what those eyes reportedly revealed to others. According to Dr. Wentworth's meticulous notes, Sarah was brought to him by the plantation overseer, a man named Jeremiah Colton, who claimed the woman had taken ill with a peculiar affliction of the eyes. The overseer reported that Sarah had begun to unsettle the other enslaved workers with what they described as her knowing gaze. Colton himself admitted to feeling deeply disturbed when Sarah looked at him, as if she could see things no person ought to see. Dr. Wentworth's initial examination revealed nothing physically unusual about Sarah's eyes. They were, as he wrote, dark brown in color, properly responsive to light, and showing no signs of infection or physical abnormality. Yet when Sarah fixed her gaze upon the doctor, he reported experiencing an immediate and profound discomfort. In his journal, he wrote, "When the woman looked directly at me, I felt as if layers of my life were being peeled away, revealing matters I had long ago buried in the deepest chambers of my mind. The sensation was most unsettling, as if she could perceive not merely my physical form, but the entirety of my history." The Fairchild plantation where Sarah lived was owned by Clayton Fairchild, a third-generation plantation owner known in Savannah society circles for his prosperity and political connections. The plantation house still stood until 1943, when it was destroyed in a fire of unknown origin. Historical records from the Savannah Municipal Archives describe it as a grand three-story structure with imposing Doric columns and extensive grounds. Behind the main house stood the quarters for enslaved workers, simple wooden structures arranged in two parallel rows, creating what was essentially a small street. Before her affliction, as it was termed, Sarah worked primarily in the main house as a domestic servant. According to household ledgers preserved in the Fairchild family collection, donated to the Georgia Historical Society in 1928, Sarah had been purchased in 1847 from a plantation in South Carolina. The ledger entry is brief, listing only her first name, an estimated age of approximately 25 years, and the sum paid. There is no mention of any family members purchased alongside her, suggesting she was separated from any family she may have had. Life on the Fairchild plantation followed the rhythms typical of large Southern agricultural enterprises of that era. Work began before sunrise and continued until dusk. The enslaved population was kept under strict surveillance, with movement restricted and gatherings closely monitored. According to an account published in the Savannah Daily News in 1882, written by a former overseer of a neighboring plantation, discipline was maintained through fear and occasional examples made of those who showed signs of rebellion. Within this environment of control and surveillance, Sarah initially appeared to adapt quietly. Household records show no mentions of disciplinary issues or escape attempts associated with her name. Martha Fairchild, the plantation mistress, noted in her personal correspondence, preserved in the Fairchild papers at the University of Georgia Special Collections, that Sarah was unusually quiet, almost to the point of being unsettling, but was diligent in her duties, and rarely needed correction. What happened to transform Sarah from an unremarkable domestic servant to the subject of a medical case puzzling enough for Dr. Wentworth to document it extensively. According to multiple sources, the change began after Sarah was assigned to care for Clayton Fairchild's elderly mother, Elizabeth, who had taken ill in the winter of 1850. Elizabeth Fairchild was known in Savannah society as a woman of strong religious conviction and somewhat eccentric beliefs. She had lived in the plantation house since her husband's death 15 years prior, and was described by visitors as a reclusive figure, often speaking of visions and signs. During the 3 months that Sarah attended to Elizabeth Fairchild, the two women spent long hours alone together in the elder woman's bedchamber on the 3rd floor of the main house. What transpired during those hours remains largely unknown, as no direct testimony from Sarah herself was ever recorded. However, Martha Fairchild noted in a letter to her sister in Charleston that Mother Fairchild and the girl Sarah have developed an unusual attachment. They speak in whispers when I enter the room, and Mother has forbidden anyone else to attend to her needs. Elizabeth Fairchild's room was situated at the eastern corner of the house, with large windows that faced the sunrise. One visitor to the plantation, a minister from Savannah named Reverend James Holloway, wrote in his journal that Elizabeth's room felt heavy with secrets, and that she had shown him curious trinkets she claimed had come from Africa, brought by an enslaved man who had once served in her household. Among these items, the Reverend described a small wooden carving of an eye, which the old woman wore on a cord around her neck. Elizabeth reportedly told him that the eye helped her to see what others wished to hide, and that it had been given to her by an enslaved man who had since died. According to household inventories, the room contained an unusual collection of items: books on spiritualism, several small statues of unknown origin, and a collection of pressed flowers preserved between glass plates. Whether this was the same wooden eye amulet later discovered by archaeologists is impossible to confirm, but the coincidence is striking. In late February 1851, Elizabeth Fairchild died in her sleep. According to household records, Sarah was the one who discovered the body and reported it to the family. It was in the days following Elizabeth's death that others began to notice the change in Sarah's demeanor, and specifically in her gaze. Jeremiah Colton, the overseer, reported to Dr. Wentworth that he had first noticed something unusual when he entered the kitchen where Sarah was working and felt, as he put it, a cold sensation, as if someone had walked over my grave. When he turned, he found Sarah looking at him with an expression that he could only describe as knowing too much. Colton claimed that in that moment he felt as if Sarah could see every awful thing I'd ever done, and that the sensation was so disturbing that he had to leave the room immediately. Similar accounts began to emerge from others on the plantation. Martha Fairchild wrote to her sister that Sarah's gaze had become unbearable, and that when their eyes met, she felt exposed in ways that no Christian woman should feel. Even Clayton Fairchild, a man described in contemporary accounts as possessing nerves of steel, reportedly began to avoid direct contact with Sarah, instructing the household staff to ensure she was never in the same room as him. The situation reached a breaking point when one of the house servants, a woman named Rebecca, suffered what witnesses described as a fit of hysterics after Sarah looked at her for an extended period. According to Dr. Wentworth's notes, Rebecca was found trembling violently and repeating the phrase, she sees it all," for nearly an hour before she could be calmed. It was at this point that Colton decided to bring Sarah to Dr. Wentworth, hoping that a medical explanation could be found for her disturbing effect on others. Dr. Wentworth's examination of Sarah extended over several days. His notes indicate that he performed all the standard medical tests known to the science of the time. He checked her pupillary responses, examined her retinas with the crude ophthalmoscope available to him, and even consulted with a colleague who had studied unusual ocular conditions in Europe. No physical abnormality could be detected. Sarah's eyes appeared, from a strictly medical standpoint, entirely normal. What was not normal, as Dr. Wentworth documented in increasingly agitated prose, was the effect those eyes had on him and others who encountered her. When she fixes her gaze upon an individual, he wrote, the subject invariably reports a sensation of having their innermost thoughts and past actions exposed to view. The effect is most pronounced when the subject has, as they perceive it, something to hide. Dr. Wentworth conducted several experiments to determine the nature and extent of Sarah's unusual ability. He arranged for her to be introduced to people she had never met before, individuals with no connection to the Fairchild plantation, to see if she would have the same effect on them. According to his notes, the results were consistent. Each person reported feeling uncomfortably exposed when Sarah looked at them directly. One such experiment involved a local judge, whose name Dr. Wentworth discreetly encoded in his notes. The judge, a respected figure in Savannah society, agreed to meet with Sarah as a favor to Dr. Wentworth, though he was told only that she was the subject of a medical study involving perception. According to Dr. Wentworth's account, the judge entered the room confidently but became visibly unsettled within minutes of Sarah's attention focusing on him. He began to perspire heavily, Dr. Wentworth wrote, and his hands shook so violently that he dropped his walking stick. When I inquired as to his distress, he muttered something about the Marshall case and abruptly left the room. Dr. Wentworth later discovered that the judge had presided over a murder trial some years earlier in which he had allegedly accepted a bribe to ensure a particular verdict. This information had never been made public and was known to very few individuals. In another particularly notable case, Dr. Wentworth introduced Sarah to a respected Savannah merchant named William Porter. Unknown to most of the community, Porter had been embezzling from his business partners for years. Within minutes of meeting Sarah, Porter reportedly became extremely agitated, accused Sarah of witchcraft, and fled the room. 3 days later, Porter confessed his financial crimes to his partners and to local authorities. When questioned about his sudden confession, he reportedly said only that her eyes saw everything I had done, and I could not bear the weight of it any longer. As Dr. Wentworth continued his examination of Sarah, he began to develop theories about the nature of her condition. In his journal he wrote, I am increasingly convinced that what we are observing is not a medical condition in the traditional sense, but rather some form of heightened perceptive ability. The woman seems capable of discerning guilt, shame, and hidden actions in those she observes, though how she does so remains a mystery. It is as if the normal barriers that prevent us from seeing into the souls of others have, in her case, been somehow removed. Dr. Wentworth's growing fascination with Sarah's case led him to propose a more extensive study. He wrote to colleagues in Charleston and Atlanta, inviting them to come to Savannah to observe Sarah for themselves. He also began to document the specific reactions people had when exposed to her gaze, creating detailed case studies of each encounter. One aspect of Sarah's condition that particularly intrigued Dr. Wentworth was the fact that not everyone seemed equally affected by her gaze. Those who reported the most intense discomfort were invariably individuals who, as later evidence would suggest, had significant secrets or guilt they were concealing. In contrast, Dr. Wentworth noted that his young assistant, a medical student named Thomas Green, experienced no unusual sensations when Sarah looked at him. The young man reports only that her gaze is unusually direct and sustained, Dr. Wentworth wrote, but he feels no particular discomfort or sense of exposure. Dr. Wentworth hypothesized that this discrepancy might indicate that Sarah's ability was not some form of mind reading, as some had suggested, but rather an exceptional sensitivity to the subtle physical signs of guilt or deception. He noted that individuals who are concealing significant secrets often display minute changes in their facial expressions, posture, and vocal patterns, changes so subtle that most people do not consciously perceive them. Sarah, he suggested, might have developed an extraordinary ability to notice and interpret these signs. perhaps as a survival mechanism in the dangerous and oppressive environment of the plantation. The human body betrays the mind's secrets in countless small ways, Dr. Wentworth wrote. A slight tension around the eyes, an almost imperceptible change in breathing, a barely noticeable flush of the skin. These are the physical manifestations of concealment and deception. Is it possible that this woman has, through some combination of natural ability and harsh necessity, learned to read these signs with perfect accuracy? And if so, might this explain the extreme discomfort experienced by those who meet her gaze? For what could be more disturbing than to realize that one's most carefully guarded secrets are, in fact, written plainly on one's own face for those who know how to look? This theory, while plausible, did not fully explain all aspects of Sarah's case, particularly the reports that she seemed to know specific details of events she could not possibly have witnessed. Dr. Wentworth acknowledged this limitation in his notes, writing, "There remains an element of her ability that eludes rational explanation. How could she know of the judge's involvement in the Marshall case, or of Porter's specific financial crimes? These are not matters that would leave physical traces discernible even to the most perceptive observer. I confess that I find myself approaching the boundaries of scientific understanding and perhaps even venturing beyond them." Clayton Fairchild, however, was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the attention Sarah was receiving. According to a letter he wrote to Dr. Wentworth, preserved in the doctor's papers, he feared that too much curiosity about the girl's condition will lead to unwanted attention on my household and business affairs. He demanded that Sarah be returned to the plantation immediately. Dr. Wentworth, reluctant to abandon his study, attempted to negotiate with Fairchild. He proposed purchasing Sarah himself, offering what his records show was a sum considerably above market value. Fairchild refused. In his response, he wrote simply, "Some things are better left unexplored. The woman returns home tomorrow. I trust you will respect my wishes in this matter." The urgency and firmness of Fairchild's demand raised questions in Dr. Wentworth's mind. In a private entry in his journal, separate from his medical notes, he wrote, "Fairchild's insistence on reclaiming the woman suggests he fears what she might reveal. I have observed his reaction when I mentioned that I intended to continue my investigation. A flash of something like panic crossed his features before he composed himself. What secret does he fear she might expose, and how does it relate to the changes observed in her after the death of his mother?" Sarah was indeed returned to the Fairchild plantation in early April 1851. What happened next is documented in fragmentary form through various sources, none of them completely reliable on their own, but which together paint a disturbing picture of the events that followed. According to accounts from neighboring plantations collected years later by a journalist for the Charleston Mercury, the atmosphere at the Fairchild plantation changed noticeably after Sarah's return. The enslaved workers reportedly began to avoid the main house whenever possible. A traveling peddler who visited the plantation in late April 1851 later told a Savannah shopkeeper that he had witnessed a strange scene. Clayton Fairchild standing at the edge of the cotton field, staring at Sarah as she worked, his face white as paper and streaming with sweat despite the cool morning air. The peddler reported that Fairchild seemed transfixed like a man watching his own doom approach, and that when Sarah briefly looked up and met his gaze, Fairchild had let out a sound like a wounded animal before turning and fleeing back to the house. Even Jeremiah Colton, the overseer, was said to have begun drinking heavily and was often seen talking to himself as he walked the property at night. Martha Fairchild's correspondence with her sister became increasingly erratic and filled with vague allusions to disturbances and a heaviness that has settled over the house. In one letter, dated May 3, 1851, she wrote, "I can scarcely sleep for the feeling of being watched. Clayton says it is merely my imagination, but I see how he avoids certain rooms, how he will not go to the third floor under any circumstance. The girl is kept busy with work far from the house now, but somehow I feel her presence everywhere. In another letter written just a week later, Martha described finding her husband in his mother's former room in the middle of the night. He was standing before the window, she wrote, speaking to someone who was not there. When I asked him what he was doing, he turned to me with such a look of terror that I nearly cried out. "She knows," he said to me. "Mother knows what I did, and she has told the girl." I tried to calm him, to assure him that it was merely a bad dream, but he pushed past me and locked himself in his study until morning. When he emerged, he spoke not a word of the incident, and I dared not mention it. On May 12, 1851, a fire broke out in the east wing of the Fairchild plantation house. The fire was contained before it could spread to the entire structure, but not before it had destroyed several rooms, including Clayton Fairchild's study. Officially, the cause was recorded as a candle left unattended, but rumors in the community suggested otherwise. A deacon from the First Baptist Church of Savannah, who had been called to the plantation to offer spiritual counsel after the fire, later told his congregation that he had sensed a darkness hanging over the Fairchild home, a sense of judgment, long deferred but finally arriving. This account, preserved in the church minutes, makes no direct mention of Sarah, but refers to a reckoning that came in the form of a woman's silent testimony. The deacon also reported that Clayton Fairchild had confessed to him a grave sin involving his mother's passing, though the specifics of this confession were not recorded, in keeping with the confidentiality of such pastoral conversations. The deacon noted, however, that Fairchild seemed to believe that his mother's spirit was somehow communicating through Sarah, revealing the truth of what had occurred in Elizabeth's final hours. This belief, while dismissed by the deacon as superstitious fancy, aligns with the accounts in Martha Fairchild's hidden journal, discovered more than a century later. Her entries suggest that Clayton had indeed been involved in his mother's death, though whether through direct action or negligence remains unclear from her fragmented descriptions. In the weeks following the fire, Clayton Fairchild's behavior reportedly became increasingly paranoid. According to accounts from business associates, documented in letters preserved in the collections of several prominent Savannah families, he began to cancel meetings, refused visitors to the plantation, and was seen in Savannah only rarely. When he did appear in public, he was described as haggard and constantly glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to find someone watching him. A clerk at the Bank of Savannah reported that Fairchild had withdrawn a substantial sum of money in early June, telling the bank manager that he was considering a journey to Europe for his health. No such journey ever took place. Instead, according to plantation records, Fairchild spent increasingly long hours alone, either in what remained of the east wing of the house or walking the boundaries of his property, particularly near the small pond that served as part of the plantation's irrigation system. On June 24, 1851, Clayton Fairchild was found dead in the small pond on the eastern edge of his property. The official cause of death was recorded as drowning, with the coroner's report suggesting that Fairchild had perhaps suffered a seizure while inspecting the irrigation system that drew water from the pond. Given his position and standing in the community, there was little appetite for a more thorough investigation. However, a letter from Dr. Wentworth to a colleague in Charleston, dated July 1, 1851, suggests that the doctor had his doubts about the official account. "The circumstances of F's death are troubling," he wrote. "The water in the pond is scarcely 3 feet deep at its center, and F was known to be a strong swimmer. Moreover, there were no signs of a seizure or struggle, according to those who found the body. It is as if he simply lay down in the shallow water and allowed himself to drown." The implication of suicide is difficult to avoid, though out of respect for the family and community, no such suggestion has been made publicly. Dr. Wentworth went on to speculate about the possible connection between Fairchild's death and Sarah's unusual condition. "I cannot help but wonder if the man's deteriorating mental state, as reported by numerous reliable sources, was connected to the woman whose case I documented. Did her penetrating gaze expose some secret that he could not bear to have revealed? And if so, what might that secret have been? The coincidence of his mother's death, the woman's changed condition, and F's subsequent decline and death suggests a connection that I cannot yet fully articulate. What happened to Sarah after Fairchild's death is not clearly documented in any single source. The plantation records show that in the settlement of Fairchild's estate, most of the enslaved workers were sold to cover his debts, which were discovered to be substantial. Martha Fairchild relocated to her family home in Charleston, taking with her only her personal maid. Sarah's name does not appear in the list of those who accompanied Martha to Charleston. Dr. Wentworth's journal contains a final entry regarding Sarah dated August 3, 1851. He writes, "I have learned today that the woman Sarah, whose remarkable condition I documented earlier this year, has disappeared from the Fairchild plantation. The new overseer hired by the estate administrators reports that she was present for the morning roll call on July 30th, but could not be found that evening. A search of the property and surrounding areas yielded no trace of her. Most curious is the report that none of the other servants seemed surprised by her absence, nor could any be persuaded to join in the search." A brief notice in the Savannah Daily News, dated August 5, 1851, mentions a female slave, property of the late Clayton Fairchild, who had escaped and was believed to be heading north. The notice included a reward offer, but provided no physical description of the woman, which was unusual for such advertisements. No subsequent reports of her capture appeared in the newspaper's archives. For nearly 7 decades, the case of Sarah and her unsettling gaze remained largely forgotten, mentioned occasionally in medical circles as an example of mass hysteria or possibly the effects of ergot poisoning from contaminated grain. Dr. Wentworth himself never published his findings, though he continued to maintain detailed notes on unusual medical cases throughout his career. In a letter to a former colleague shortly before his death in 1887, he reflected on Sarah's case, writing, "Of all the medical mysteries I encountered in my long practice, none has continued to haunt my thoughts as persistently as that of the woman with the truth-seeing eyes. I still cannot explain what I observed, and I have come to believe that perhaps some aspects of human experience lie beyond our current scientific understanding." In 1919, however, the story resurfaced when a history professor from Howard University, Dr. Marcus Jenkins, discovered Dr. Wentworth's papers while researching pre-Civil War medical practices in the South. Jenkins was immediately struck by the detailed documentation of Sarah's case and began to investigate whether any additional information about her could be found. His search led him to the Georgia Historical Society, where he discovered a collection of documents related to Underground Railroad activities in the Savannah area. Among these papers was a journal kept by a Quaker abolitionist named Abigail Tompkins, who had helped enslaved people escape to freedom. An entry dated August 4, 1851, makes reference to a woman with remarkable eyes who sees the truth in men's souls, who had been brought to Tompkins's home by friends who recognized her value. The entry goes on to state that the woman was being sent north via the network of safe houses maintained by abolitionists. Tompkins's journal provides one of the few accounts that includes something close to Sarah's own perspective. She writes, "When I asked the woman about her unusual gift, she spoke for the first time since arriving at our door. 'It is not a gift,' she told me, 'but a burden placed upon me by a dying woman who could not bear to take her knowledge to the grave.' When I inquired further, she would say only that she had been made a witness to a terrible truth, and that her eyes now compelled others to see themselves as they truly were. The woman carries with her a small wooden carving of an eye, which she says helps her to control her ability somewhat, allowing her to look upon people without causing them immediate distress. I do not pretend to understand such matters, but I have seen enough in this world to know that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in our philosophy." Jenkins continued his research, tracking references to a woman matching Sarah's description, through abolitionist correspondence and journals. He found a mention in the records of a Quaker community in Pennsylvania of a refugee from Georgia whose gaze causes men to confess their sins, who stayed with the community for several months in early 1852 before moving on, presumably to Canada. A letter from one community member to another, dated March 1852, described the woman's effect on a local merchant who had been cheating his customers for years. He now goes about making amends, paying back with interest those he had cheated, all because, as he puts it, she saw the ledger of my soul, and I could no longer hide from the truth written there. Many in the community now avoid her company, fearing what her eyes might reveal, while others seek her out, believing that confronting one's hidden shames is a path to redemption. In 1922, Jenkins published a monograph titled The Witness, The Case of the Enslaved Woman with Truth-Seeing Eyes, in which he presented his findings and offered his interpretation of the events at the Fairchild plantation. After but 5 minutes in her company, the letter stated, Harrison returned to his shop and immediately began calculating what he owed to each person he had wronged. According to Jenkins, Sarah's condition was not a medical anomaly, but rather an extraordinary psychological ability that had developed as a survival mechanism in the brutal environment of slavery. Jenkins theorized that Sarah, forced to anticipate the moods and reactions of those who held power over her, had developed an exceptional ability to read subtle facial expressions, body language, and vocal tones that revealed deception or hidden emotions. This ability, combined with what Jenkins described as a gaze of unusual intensity and focus, created the unsettling effect that others had experienced. When confronted with a person who seems able to see through their carefully constructed pretenses, Jenkins wrote, most individuals experience profound discomfort. When that person is someone they have relegated to the status of property, someone they have convinced themselves is less than fully human, the effect is magnified exponentially. What Sarah possessed was not supernatural sight, but rather an unblinking recognition of the humanity she shared with those who denied her own, a recognition so powerful that it forced them to see themselves as they truly were. Jenkins also proposed a theory about what might have happened between Sarah and Elizabeth Fairchild during the elder woman's final months. Based on the fragmentary evidence available, he suggested that Elizabeth, perhaps recognizing her impending death and troubled by guilty knowledge about her son's financial and moral failings, had formed a bond with Sarah. Elizabeth might have confided in Sarah, sharing family secrets that gave Sarah insight into Clayton Fairchild's character and actions. The dying woman, seeking some form of absolution or justice, Jenkins wrote, may have unburdened herself to the one person in the household who had no power to use the information against the family, but who nevertheless retained the human capacity to bear witness to the truth. In doing so, she inadvertently transformed Sarah from a silenced observer to a powerful repository of dangerous knowledge that, combined with Sarah's perceptiveness, made her an intolerable presence for those with secrets to hide. Jenkins's interpretation gained some acceptance in academic circles, but the story of Sarah remained largely unknown to the general public. That changed in 1937 when the Federal Writers Project, as part of the Works Progress Administration, began collecting oral histories from formerly enslaved individuals and their descendants. Among these collected narratives was an account from a woman named Esther Williams, then 91 years old and living in Buffalo, New York. Williams claimed that her grandmother had been enslaved on a plantation near Savannah and had told her stories of a woman named Sarah, whose eyes could see right through a lie. According to Williams's testimony, Sarah had escaped north and eventually settled in a small community of formerly enslaved people in southern Ontario, where she was known as Mother Truth. Williams's account included details not found in Dr. Wentworth's notes or other written records suggesting an oral tradition that had preserved aspects of Sarah's story independently. She described how Sarah would sometimes sit with people who were troubled and simply look at them until, as Williams put it, the truth they'd been running from came right out of their mouths. Williams also claimed that Sarah had helped many people in the community resolve long-standing conflicts by bringing hidden grievances to light. "My grandmother told me," Williams recounted, "that Mother Truth never used her gift to punish or shame people, only to help them face what they needed to face. Some folks would avoid her crossing the street when they saw her coming, but others would seek her out when they couldn't sleep for the weight of something heavy on their hearts. She would just sit with them, sometimes for hours, without a word being spoken, until they found the courage to say aloud what they'd been keeping inside." Williams also shared a detail that connected directly to the historical record. "My grandmother said that Mother Truth always wore a wooden eye on a cord around her neck, and that sometimes she would hold it up before looking at someone, especially if they seemed afraid of her gaze. She said it helped her to see clearly without causing too much pain to the person being seen." In 1952, a historian at the University of Toronto, Dr. Eleanor Pearson, became interested in the settlement Williams had described and began researching census records and local historical documents. She discovered evidence of a small community of formerly enslaved Americans who had settled near Dresden, Ontario in the 1850s. Community records mention a woman known as Sarah the Seer, who had lived there until her death in 1887. The local church registry included a record of Sarah's marriage in 1855 to a man named Joseph Freeman, who had escaped slavery in Virginia. Together they had raised 3 children. The church records also noted that Sarah served as a kind of unofficial counselor to the community, with the minister writing that her insight into troubled hearts brings many to seek her wisdom in times of conflict or confusion. A local newspaper, the Dresden Weekly, contained an obituary for this woman, describing her as a respected elder whose counsel was sought by many in times of confusion or conflict. The obituary made no mention of her unusual eyes or ability to discern truth, but did note that her penetrating wisdom will be greatly missed. Of particular interest to Dr. Pearson was a small notebook found among the possessions of the minister of the Dresden church, which contained accounts of some of the more unusual events in the community's history. One entry described a visit by a prominent local businessman who had initially come to discredit the former slave woman who claims to see the truth. According to the minister's account, the businessman left the meeting visibly shaken, and subsequently confessed to his wife a long-concealed affair that had troubled their marriage for years. He reported, the minister wrote, that he had intended to mock and challenge the woman, but that when she looked at him, he felt as if the walls he had built around his secret life crumbled to dust, leaving him no choice but to acknowledge the truth he had denied for so long. Dr. Pearson's research, which she compiled for an academic article that was never published due to her untimely death in 1954, also uncovered a daguerreotype purportedly showing Sarah in her later years. The image, now held in the archives of Ontario, shows an elderly black woman with a direct, unflinching gaze that seems to look not at the camera, but through it. Contemporary viewers of the image often report feeling an unusual sense of discomfort or exposure when meeting the subject's eyes, even across the distance of time and medium. The daguerreotype also clearly shows a small pendant hanging from a cord around the woman's neck. Though the image is not detailed enough to confirm that this is the wooden eye described in other accounts, the similarity is suggestive. A handwritten note on the back of the daguerreotype's case reads simply, "Sarah Freeman, known to many as Mother Truth, Dresden, 1880. In 1958, Dr. Jenkins' monograph was discovered by Dr. Richard Harland, a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University who had an interest in unusual psychological phenomena. Harland was fascinated by the case and began to investigate it from a scientific perspective. He contacted the Georgia Historical Society and gained access to Dr. Wentworth's original papers, which included more detailed notes on Sarah's examinations than had been included in Jenkins's publication. Harland was particularly interested in Dr. Wentworth's observation that Sarah's pupils dilated very little even in low-light conditions. In a paper published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 1960, Harlan suggested that this unusual pupillary response might indicate an atypical functioning of Sarah's autonomic nervous system, which could in turn be related to her apparent ability to observe and process micro-expressions and other subtle cues of deception. The eyes, Harlan wrote, are often described as the windows to the soul in poetic terms, but in neurological terms, they are indeed windows to many unconscious processes. Pupillary responses, eye movement patterns, and blink rates are all involuntarily affected by emotional states, attention, and cognitive processing. A person with abnormal pupillary control might maintain a more fixed and penetrating gaze than is typical, creating the subjective experience in others of being seen through. Combined with an exceptional ability to read micro-expressions, those fleeting involuntary facial movements that often reveal concealed emotions, such an individual might indeed seem to possess an uncanny ability to discern hidden truths. Harlan also noted similarities between Sarah's case and documented instances of truth detection, abilities in individuals who had experienced severe trauma. He proposed that the extreme conditions of enslavement, combined with whatever experiences Sarah had undergone before arriving at the Fairchild plantation, might have created a form of hypervigilance that manifested as an exceptional ability to read others. Those who survive in threatening environments, he observed, often develop heightened sensitivity to subtle cues that might indicate danger. For someone living under the constant threat of violence inherent in the slave system, the ability to accurately read the emotions and intentions of those with power over one's life would be not merely a psychological curiosity, but a crucial survival mechanism. What is particularly fascinating about Sarah's case is the suggestion that this ability was somehow intensified or transformed following her interactions with Elizabeth Fairchild, raising questions about the potential role of suggestion, belief, or even the power of symbolic objects like the wooden eye amulet in shaping how such abilities are experienced and expressed. Harlan's paper attracted attention in psychiatric circles, but also criticism from those who felt he was attempting to medicalize what was essentially a case of psychological insight combined with the projection of guilt by those complicit in the system of slavery. The debate might have remained confined to academic journals if not for a series of events that began in 1962. That year, during renovations of one of the few remaining outbuildings from the original Fairchild plantation, workers discovered a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in the space between a floor and ceiling beam. The bundle contained a leather-bound book, its pages filled with handwriting. The book was turned over to the Georgia Historical Society, where archivists identified it as a journal kept by Martha Fairchild during the period when Sarah was at the plantation. The journal, which had apparently been hidden rather than taken with Martha when she left for Charleston, contained much more explicit references to the events surrounding Sarah than her letters had. In entries beginning shortly after Elizabeth Fairchild's death, Martha described increasingly disturbing interactions with Sarah. The way she looks at Clayton, one entry reads, "It is as if she knows what happened in Mother Fairchild's room that night. But she could not know. No one was there but Clayton and the old woman. And yet, when Sarah brought in the tea this afternoon, Clayton went white as a sheet when their eyes met. He knocked over his cup and left the room without a word." Later entries become more fragmented and suggestive. Martha writes of voices from the third floor when no one should be there, of Mother Fairchild's bell ringing in the night, months after her death, of Sarah being found standing motionless in Elizabeth's former room, looking at nothing anyone else could see. Perhaps most disturbing is an entry dated April 17, 1851, in which Martha recounts finding a small wooden object in Sarah's sleeping quarters during an impulsive search of the slave cabins. "It was an eye," she wrote, "carved from wood and painted, identical to the one Mother Fairchild always wore, but which we could not find after her death. I intended to confiscate it, but when I touched it, I felt such a chill pass through me that I dropped it as if it had burned my fingers. I left it where it lay and have told no one, not even Clayton, of what I found. Martha's journal also contains veiled references to tensions between Clayton and his mother over financial matters. In an entry dated just 2 weeks before Elizabeth's death, she wrote, "Another dreadful argument between C and Mother F today. She threatens again to change her will, to leave everything to his cousin in Charleston. She called him a disgrace to his father's name. He says she is confused, that her mind is failing, but I see no evidence of it. She is as sharp as ever, particularly when it comes to the account books, which she still insists on reviewing each month. She knows, I think, about the loans, about the new investments that have not paid off. C was in such a state afterward that I feared for his health. He kept saying, 'Something must be done,' though he would not tell me what he meant by it." Most disturbing are Martha's descriptions of her husband's deteriorating mental state. "Clayton wakes screaming every night now," she wrote, in early June 1851. "He swears he sees Mother Fairchild standing at the foot of our bed, her lips moving, but no sound coming out. And behind her, always Sarah, just watching with those terrible knowing eyes." The final entry, dated June 23, 1851, the day before Clayton Fairchild's death, reads simply, "He has gone to the pond. He says there is no other way. May God have mercy on his soul and on mine for what we have done." The discovery of Martha Fairchild's journal reignited interest in the case of Sarah and her truth-seeing eyes. A young journalist named Michael Lawson, working for the Atlanta Constitution, wrote a series of articles exploring the history of the Fairchild plantation and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Clayton Fairchild's death. Lawson's investigation led him to suggest that perhaps Fairchild's drowning had not been accidental, but rather a suicide prompted by unbearable guilt that Sarah's penetrating gaze had somehow forced him to confront. Lawson also tracked down descendants of individuals who had been enslaved at the Fairchild plantation, hoping to find additional oral history accounts that might shed light on Sarah and the events of 1851. One elderly man, whose grandmother had been a house servant at the plantation, told Lawson a story that had been passed down through his family. According to this account, Clayton Fairchild had indeed murdered his mother, Elizabeth, by smothering her with a pillow as she slept. The motive was supposedly financial. Elizabeth had threatened to change her will, removing Clayton as the primary beneficiary due to his increasing debts and what she saw as moral failings. Sarah, assigned to care for the elderly woman, had witnessed the murder but had been powerless to intervene or to speak of what she had seen afterward. The family story suggested that Elizabeth Fairchild, in her final moments, had somehow transferred a gift to Sarah, the ability to see the truth of a person's actions by looking into their eyes. Whether this was meant literally or as a metaphorical explanation for Sarah's unusual perceptiveness, the account aligned with the documented effects Sarah had on those around her, particularly Clayton Fairchild. "My grandmother told us," the man recounted to Lawson, "that old Mrs. Fairchild had this carved eye she wore around her neck. She said it helped her see people's true selves beyond the faces they showed to the world. When her son came to her room that night, she knew why he had come. She took off the eye and pressed it into Sarah's hand, telling her to be her witness, to see the truth and remember. After that night, whenever Sarah looked at the master, he would start trembling, like he was standing in snow without a coat." This oral history account added a new dimension to the story, suggesting a possible origin for Sarah's ability that combined elements of symbolic transference, psychological suggestion, and the power of witnessed truth. It also aligned with the physical evidence of the wooden eye amulet discovered by archaeologists in 1967. Lawson's articles, published in the summer of 1963, caught the attention of Dr. Benjamin Marshall, a neurologist at Emory University who specialized in visual processing disorders. Marshall was skeptical of supernatural explanations, but intrigued by the consistency of reports about Sarah's unusual ability. He wondered if she might have had a rare neurological condition that affected her visual processing in ways that science in the 1850s could not have detected or understood. In a paper presented to the American Neurological Association in 1964, Marshall proposed that Sarah might have had a form of synesthesia, a condition where stimulation of one sensory pathway leads to involuntary experiences in another. In most documented cases, synesthesia involves seeing colors when hearing sounds or experiencing tastes when seeing certain shapes. Such a condition, Marshall wrote, combined with the heightened observational skills that many marginalized individuals develop as a survival mechanism, could have created the impression of an almost supernatural ability to see the truth. The discomfort others felt when Sarah looked at them might have been a response to the unusual fixed quality of her gaze, possibly related to how her visual system was processing information differently. Marshall's hypothesis remains one of the most credible scientific explanations proposed for Sarah's condition, though it cannot be tested given the historical nature of the case. Marshall suggested that Sarah might have experienced a rare form where visual input, seeing a person's face, triggered an intuitive understanding of that person's emotional state or recent actions. What is certain is that the story of Sarah and her truth-seeing eyes left an indelible mark on those who encountered her, and on the historical record of the Fairchild Plantation. The final piece of the puzzle emerged in 1967, when an archaeological team from the University of Georgia conducted a survey of the former Fairchild Plantation site, which was being prepared for commercial development. During their excavation, they discovered the remains of a small object buried near the foundation of what had once been the plantation's main house. The object, carefully preserved and later identified by experts at the Smithsonian Institution, was a hand-carved wooden eye, approximately the size of a silver dollar. One side was flat, while the other was convex and painted to resemble a human eye with a dark iris and pupil. Tiny holes had been drilled through the top, suggesting it had once been worn as a pendant. According to ethnographic experts consulted by the archaeological team, the eye pendant bore a strong resemblance to protective amulets used in certain West African spiritual traditions, particularly those associated with truth-telling and bearing witness. Such amulets were believed to protect the wearer from deception and to strengthen their ability to see hidden truths. The archaeologists also discovered that the eye had been deliberately buried in a small, fabric-lined hollow that had been created specifically to house it. This suggested that the object had been intentionally placed there as part of a ritual or for safekeeping, rather than simply lost or discarded. Dr. Carolyn Matthews, the lead archaeologist on the project, wrote in her report, "The careful manner in which the eye amulet was buried, combined with its placement near the foundation of the main house, suggests that it held significant importance to whoever placed it there. The location, approximately beneath what would have been a window of the east wing, which historical records indicate contained Elizabeth Fairchild's bedroom, may indicate a connection to the stories associated with that room and its occupants. Carbon dating of the wood suggested that the eye amulet had been created in the early to mid-19th century, placing it within the time frame of Sarah's presence at the Fairchild Plantation. Given its location, buried just outside what would have been Elizabeth Fairchild's ground floor window, some researchers have suggested a connection between the amulet Sarah and the elderly woman she attended in her final months. Did Elizabeth Fairchild, known for her interest in spiritual matters, give Sarah the amulet? Did Sarah create it herself, drawing on cultural knowledge preserved despite the brutal attempts to erase African heritage through the institution of slavery? Or was it placed there after the events of 1851, perhaps by someone seeking to commemorate what had occurred? The historical record offers no definitive answers. What we do know is that in the years following Clayton Fairchild's death, the plantation fell into decline. Martha Fairchild never returned from Charleston, and the property changed hands several times before being largely abandoned after the Civil War. Local legends began to emerge about the place being haunted by eyes that see too much. And even after the main house burned in 1943, local residents tended to avoid the area, especially after dark. A local historian, interviewed for a Savannah newspaper in 1970, recalled that as a child in the 1920s, he and his friends would dare each other to spend the night on the overgrown property. No one ever made it past midnight, he said. There was something about that place that made you feel like you were being watched from every direction at once. Like 1,000 eyes could see right through you, could see every bad thing you'd ever done or thought about doing. We all felt it, and none of us was brave enough to face it for a whole night. As for Sarah herself, if Dr. Jenkins's research is correct, she lived out her life in freedom in Canada, using her remarkable perceptiveness to help others in her community resolve conflicts and confront hidden truths. The daguerreotype purportedly showing her in her later years reveals a face lined with age, but with eyes that remain clear and direct, eyes that, according to those who view the image even today, seem to look straight into the viewer's soul. A descendant of the Dresden community, interviewed by a Canadian filmmaker in 1965 for a documentary that was never completed, shared stories passed down about Mother Truth and her unusual ability. She wasn't feared here the way they say she was down south, the woman recalled. People respected her gift because she used it to heal, not to harm. She could see the broken places in people, the parts they tried to hide from themselves and others. But instead of using that to shame them, she would help them find a way to mend what was broken. That's a different kind of seeing, not just seeing what's wrong, but seeing the path to making it right. The case of the eyes of the enslaved woman, science couldn't explain, remains a compelling mystery at the intersection of medical history, the brutal legacy of American slavery, and the human capacity to perceive truth beyond words. Was Sarah's ability the result of a rare neurological condition, an extraordinary psychological adaptation to trauma, or something that science still cannot fully explain? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the spaces between these possibilities, in the realm where human perception and understanding continue to evolve. What seems clear from the historical record is that Sarah, a woman denied freedom, education, and basic human rights, nevertheless possessed a form of power that those who sought to control her could neither understand nor resist, the power of bearing witness to truth. In a system built on lies and denial, her unflinching gaze became a form of resistance that ultimately contributed to the unraveling of at least one man who had convinced himself that his actions existed beyond the reach of judgment or consequence. In 1968, the archaeological site that had once been the Fairchild Plantation was paved over to make way for a shopping center. The wooden eye amulet was sent to the Smithsonian Institution's collection of African American historical artifacts, where it remains today, occasionally displayed in exhibitions about spiritual practices and resistance during slavery. The daguerreotype, believed to show Sarah in her later years, hangs in a small museum in Dresden, Ontario, devoted to preserving the history of formerly enslaved Americans who found freedom in Canada. Dr. Wentworth's papers, including his detailed notes on Sarah's case, are preserved in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, available to researchers who continue to be drawn to this unusual case. Martha Fairchild's hidden journal is there as well, its final pages stained with what appears to be water damage, but might be tears. And somewhere, perhaps, the truth of what happened at the Fairchild Plantation in the spring of 1851 still exists, not just in documents and artifacts, but in the enduring power of a gaze that could see through deception to the hidden heart of things. A gaze that reminds us that no matter how deeply we bury our secrets, there is always the possibility that someone, somewhere, will see us as we truly are. In the words that close Martha Fairchild's journal, her eyes remain even when she is gone. I feel them still watching, knowing. And I wonder if, in the end, that is how justice finally comes, not through courts or laws, but through being truly seen with nowhere left to hide. If you walk today through the bustling shopping center that stands where the Fairchild plantation once spread its fields of cotton and corn, you might feel nothing unusual. But some visitors, especially those who lingered near what would have been the site of the main house, report a sudden, inexplicable feeling of being observed, of having their innermost thoughts suddenly exposed to view. And in that moment, they understand what it might have been like to meet the gaze of a woman whose eyes could pierce through 2 centuries of silence to reveal truths that some would prefer remain buried forever. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Sarah's story is not the mystery of her unusual ability, but the power that comes from bearing witness to truth in a society built on lies, in a world where people could be owned, where families could be torn apart, where cruelty could be codified into law. The simple act of seeing clearly and refusing to look away was itself a form of resistance. Sarah's gaze forced those around her to confront the humanity they had denied, both hers and their own. As Dr. Jenkins wrote in the conclusion to his monograph, the enslaved woman's eyes became a mirror in which others were forced to see themselves as they truly were, not as they pretended to be. In this way, she achieved a kind of freedom even before she physically escaped north. Her spirit remained unowned, her perception unclouded by the lies that sustained the system that sought to contain her. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to see and to be seen in all our complicated humanity. In the end, the mystery of Sarah's eyes may never be fully explained by science or history, but perhaps that is as it should be. Some truths can only be glimpsed, never fully captured, like meeting a penetrating gaze that sees through all pretense, leaving us both exposed and, paradoxically, more fully ourselves than we were before.